I'd like to turn to our next speaker, Violane Iglesias, CEO and co-founder of Cadmore Media. So, Violane, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Great. Can you share your screen?
I'm going to try that.
Looks like it's starting. Excellent.
All right. Can you see? I'm just trying to get rid of my bar at the bottom. There you go.
That's perfect.
Are you seeing just a beautiful planet with a bunch of nodes over it?
That's exactly what we're seeing.
And not the presenter view. I'm just making sure. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill. So thank you very much for having me today. What I am going to talk about is focused on multimedia, so audio and video. And it's going to be an angle that's very much focused on advocacy rather than the technicalities of how to make multimedia accessible. I'm going to brush on that, but I'm not a technical expert on accessibility at all. What I mostly is a very enthusiastic and evangelist for this. So what I'm hoping you can get out of this presentation are arguments for, I'm assuming everybody who's attending this conference is already an advocate for accessibility, but I'm hoping to give you more arguments for helping your organization make their multimedia content more accessible. So just a few notes about me. I have a publisher background mostly. So been to school quite a lot. I worked with languages a lot, hence a little bit of my interest in closed captions and transcripts, which I'm going to talk about a lot today. I've worked for publishers both in the trade space, but also in the academic space. I now run a company called Cadmore Media. It's a young company. We founded it about 2 years ago. It's a video hosting company that I'll just brush on what we do. I also run, we're NISO members, of course, and I run a NISO working group that is looking at creating guidelines for video and audio metadata. So we're not looking at recreating a standard, but we're looking at guidelines to make sure that publishers, librarians speak the same language and have at least clues for what kind of standards they should be using when it comes to video and audio in the context of mostly scholarly communications. But part of that work, it actually includes looking at the accessibility guidelines. So I will definitely look at the resources that George was mentioning. So, and there's a little flag on the right that shows I'm both French and American. And that is something that I mention quite a lot because I'm not a native English speaker, and I rely on, for audio and video, I rely on tools that are, I personally rely on tools that are mostly aimed at people with disabilities. So the other thing I will mention is that this presentation does not have many words, the slides on them, but it's mostly based on an article that I wrote. So I added the link at the bottom, and I'm hoping that if the slides are shared, you're gonna get that link. So this is an article that I wrote about a couple years ago that basically says the same thing that I'm going to say today. So if you need access to more references or more details, it's all in there, and it's open access. So just a quick word about our company. We are, as I said, we're a company that provides video services, but specifically to scholarly and professional organizations. So we are very focused on content that is highly technical, that is oftentimes difficult, and we mostly focus on serious videos. That's actually how my 8-year-old son describes what I do. Is he says, "Mom does serious video." So that's really what we're focused on. We provide a player that is an accessible player. We provide media libraries that can also be used, that include our player, obviously, that are also accessible. And we can provide integrations to bring accessible video into publishers' infrastructure. And we also have, there's something that's not on here, but we also have quite a few partners that provide services that can be helpful for making your content accessible. One thing I'll say about the company is that we are very focused on accessibility for different reasons. One reason is that we work with publishers who were trying to push in the direction of making more content accessible. It's always better if it's the publishers making the content accessible rather than the libraries who are going to purchase that content, because it's better if it's born accessible. Another reason is our CTO is actually visually impaired. So he has an impairment that has made him both an advocate for accessibility, but also an expert in how to make content not just accessible as in compliant with guidelines, but we actually really make sure that all of our technology is usable and usable by in real life. So technically, multimedia accessibility is referenced in all the guidelines as time-based media. So time-based media has a bunch of different formats. It could be audio only, audio video, etc. It could be live, it could be recorded, pre-recorded. In a nutshell, it is just anything that's got video and audio is going to be affected by these guidelines. And generally, there is more audio and video content that people think. So what we do is we're often on the road talking to a lot of societies and publishers, especially asking them about their plans for video, what kind of video they have, what kind of video they want to produce, what kind of video they're collecting. And there's always more video. It could be podcasts, it could be collections that they're producing, it could be lectures, it could be in some cases video journals. And so these days, obviously the world has changed quite a bit in the past 2 months, and specifically our world has changed quite a bit because we've been advocating generally not just for accessibility, but for video in the first place. And because the world is moving online, the accessibility requirements for events have completely shifted from making sure that people can access a building to making sure people can access a video or an online conference. So that paradigm has really changed the way that we work. The main consequence of the crisis that we're in for us is just that there's a lot more video content that is being produced. And that is obviously true for the people that we work with, so the publishers and the societies, but obviously also true for academic institutions, which are moving to lectures online. So video accessibility has become more important all of a sudden. So what does it take to make time-based content accessible? There are two broad categories of things that need to be accessible, as with pretty much every content type. So one of them is the content. So the first thing that's needed, I'm not going to dig into too much detail here, but I'm just going to go over the broad guidelines. So the first thing that you should think about really when you think about multimedia accessibility is closed captions. So that's text alternatives to the narration of a video or an audio file. And closed captions are typically the same thing as transcripts. They're just formatted differently, but it's going to be the same text. Audio alternatives are audio descriptions that accompany videos by describing what happens on the screen. And visual alternatives are mostly sign language translations. Those are level AAA, a requirement at level AAA. They're less frequent in our space. So I listed those three in order of what I would say prevalence. So text alternative, the captions and transcripts are mainstream. Audio descriptions are not mainstream, but they're becoming more so. You'll see, for example, if you get on a plane, you now have audio descriptions available on a selection of content. I get into regular Twitter fights with United Airlines so that they actually make this available for all of their offering, but at least it's getting there. So, and the second thing I would mention about the content is that the content, the videos themselves need to be accessible. So it's not only what you're going to add to the video as alternatives that is going to make it accessible, but you also need to make sure that your video has the right colors and the right fonts, etc. That is especially true of presentations. Again, going back to events and PowerPoints. If you're going to be recording a presentation, the presentation itself needs to follow the guidelines of text content types. So the second category of things that are needed to make multimedia content accessible is an accessible player. So an accessible player needs to be screen reader compatible and keyboard accessible. It needs to have the same things that you would expect of a website. So enough contrast, enough ways to navigate it in different ways. But I will also say that the player itself is not going to be enough, because the player is typically video is embedded, streaming video is embedded on another website. And so even if you have made every effort to make your video content accessible, if it sits on a website that's not accessible, people are not going to be able to get to it. So an accessible website is actually an indirect requirement. I added a link to the specific guidelines for this. So if you need to dig into the details, you can find it easily. So here's an example of our player. I use this video obviously because we host, if anybody has attended the NISO Plus conference in February, which did happen in person, we do host a website called NISO Video. I added a link to this particular video at the bottom of this page, and it shows our player. So the characteristics of an accessible player are, as I was saying, closed captions, transcripts. So in this case, this is an interactive transcript that you can click on to navigate the video itself. This is also compatible with screen readers, which becomes interesting when it comes to a transcript, because you don't want, for example, the screen reader to be reading the transcript at the same time as the narration. So there's consideration like that are really specific to video. Otherwise, the rest of it is your typical web accessibility with all the emphasis on navigation. So there's a link there, and it's open to everybody if you want to go take a look at it. So why is multimedia accessibility important? The first thing that I always want to say, I used to finish presentations with this, but now I really start there. It's just because that's the right thing to do. So you don't want to exclude up to 15 or 20% of the population. Life is online, video is online, video is important. You just don't want to exclude anybody. And commercially, anybody who just by default excludes parts of the population is probably doing some math wrong. So the main driver for the rise in accessibility compliance is lawsuits. So the legal mandates are here. You've got, of course, the ADA in the US, in the UK, and Australia. These are just examples of laws that are in place. The European Accessibility Act of 2019 also made it even more important to make the content accessible, because it formalized those requirements. And so I quoted it, and I actually would encourage you to go to their site, because they have a lot of very good statistics and arguments for making the content accessible. So I'm quoting our partner, a captioning partner, Multimedia, who is noting a 181% increase in the number of lawsuits between 2017 and 2018. So there is really an increase in lawsuits. And anecdotally, when we speak to our clients, the clients we had a few societies, for example, who we talked about, and we didn't have to argue for accessibility at all, because they said, we were sued, everything is just made accessible. So unfortunately, fear is still the main driver. Demand is too. So this, I wish this graph was more accessible, if I'm honest. But so this is from a study that was done in 2017. This is a study that I was part of that asked both publishers and libraries about higher education institutions and societies, that asked what was the most important thing that they wanted to see for a video. So the question was quite far-ranging. And you may or may not be able to see, but the two really longest lines that stand out from the rest are from the higher education institutions, the demand for transcripts and closed captions. So there was a real gap between the demand on the library side versus the demand on the society and the publisher side. So that is, I guess, closing that gap is something that we work on every day. So good arguments. Global audience is the first very obvious one. So there are the arguments that, of course, multimedia is necessary for people with disabilities. But I think in the case of multimedia, there are so many different benefits to making your content accessible that are applicable to everybody, or at least 95% of people. So that's kind of, these are the arguments that I'm going to focus on. So the obvious incentive is that adding captions and transcripts to your videos is going to enable you to reach a more global audience. So as I said, I'm French American, I can speak English well, I always have captions on. So the example I had in my, the anecdote I had in that article that I wrote was about Catherine Hepburn quotes, but I will also say I was just watching Outlander yesterday night and I do not understand Scottish accents at all. So I watched it with the subtitles on and they were off at some point and I just could not understand anything. So understanding audio is just more difficult than understanding text, and it's going to help anybody who's not a native speaker. And it's going to help both your speakers be more comfortable with having a recorded version of their presentation, for example, if there are subtitles that are going to help other people understand it. But of course, it's also good for non-native audiences. So you just broaden both your author pool and your audience pool if you add captions. And translations are great, but captions, even of the original language of the video, already help a lot. I will say, because we work a lot in the research space, that English is the main language of research, but it's not the language of most researchers. So this is an area in which everybody communicates in a language that's not their native language. There are other reasons. Technical words, for example, might be something that for early career researchers or non-technical people, having the written version of a word of a technical term is also something that's going to help them, especially again if it's said with an accent. User experience and engagement, that's a really big one. So I'm sure you've all seen on social media, for example, the rise of captions. That is because oftentimes you browse your phone in a silent environment, so you're watching a video, but you're not actually watching it with the sound on, you just can't. Or the other way around, you're in a noisy environment and you just can't hear what's being said. It goes back to my plain examples where it's really hard to actually hear something on just listen to the audio of a movie, in which case having the captions really help. The captions and the transcripts will also help with navigating the content. So if you have an interactive transcripts that like the one I was showing before, this is something that's going to enable you to skim a video. So watching a video requires a different type of time commitment than an article would require, for example. So if you start reading an article, if you start reading a book chapter or even a book, you can actually skim through the chapters and you can skim through the headlines and you're going to say, okay, this is what this is going to be about. This is what I want to read. When you're talking about entertainment, a movie, you probably don't want to know what's coming. When it comes to professional information and any sort of educational content, yes, you absolutely want to know what's coming because you want to be able to structure your time. So having the transcript specifically, or those are not the captions, but having the transcript really helps in that case, just getting to that part of the video that's going to be interesting to you. It helps to go back to it. It just helps navigating this content better. Otherwise, you just start watching an hour video, you have no clue what's in there, and it's a bet whether it's going to be good use of your time or not. Another thing that has been studied is that it's easier to retain information. The jury is out on whether it's easier to retain information if it's in audio or in text form, but there is definitely an advantage to having both. So if you have a video, having the captions on and the transcripts on, there's studies that show that students in particular actually retain the information better if they have this. I'm a visual person. I don't hear numbers, for example. I have to see them written to understand them. And it's pretty much the same thing when I'm watching a video. I need to see something written in order to really retain it. So that's not the entire population, but if it's half the population, it's already worth it. In terms of user experience, I will also say that making sure that your player and the place that it sits in is well laid out, follows the principles of universal designs with controls that are clearly labeled and easy to use. It just gives a better user experience for all the users, not just who are consuming the content with a screen reader or with a keyboard, for example. Search engine optimization, that is also a biggie. Making your content accessible boosts its open web discoverability considerably. So generally what makes a website popular, video is something that makes a website very popular. And by popular, I mean popular with Google. So websites with video generally rank higher in those Google search results. And the more Google is going to know about the video, so for example, through structured metadata, transcripts, audio descriptions, the more Google knows about your video, the higher it's going to rank it. Both the closed captions, the transcripts can be crawled if they're set up properly. So by having a transcript, you actually tell so much more information about the video to Google that Google is way more likely to surface it. So you can actually surface a video, a moment in a video where somebody said something that was related to what you're looking for. Having transcripts also enables you to create more metadata and to extract keywords, for example, that you can also tag appropriately for Google to get. And I'm mentioning Google, but obviously that's true of all the search results. It's just that most searches are done on Google. Google also cares a lot about how long people spend on your website, and there has also been research that shows that people watch a video longer if there is a transcript or a closed caption. So that is also another argument for making sure that people are engaged with the content, stay on the website, and that's also going to help with your SEO. How many links to a website is very important as well. And if you have text for your video, it's going to be much easier for you to post snippets of it on social media and create posts about it, etc. So there's just many different ways in which multimedia accessibility can improve SEO. So SEO is just part of the equation, of course, when it comes to discoverability. There's also library discoverability and indexation in particular. So it's the same thing. If you've got a platform, even if it's not on the open web, but you can index all the full text of the transcript in a search engine. If you have better metadata, you can enable citations on your video. You can enable proper cataloging of the videos. So that's what we're looking for with a NISO working group. And accessibility metadata is going to be part of this, obviously. So it's also easier. I want to emphasize reusability a little bit. It's also much easier if you have all your content transcribed. It's much easier to know what's in it and then to reuse it to create a new digital product or to interlink the content with other types of content, including books and journals, etc. So it just, instead of having a bunch of videos that sit somewhere that you don't really know, where you don't really know what's in it, if you can analyze the content better, you are able to create more interesting things with them, products. So there are some hurdles. Accessibility is an afterthought. I'm sure that's going to be a theme of the day, where you start by putting a product out there, and then you decide, and then you realize it should be accessible. So that seems to be changing. the main hurdle, I would say, is still the cost, especially for captions and transcripts, because that is a cost that is pretty much incompressible. Speech to text technology is not good enough yet to be used as is. It's good enough to create a raw transcript that can be searched, for example, but it just still creates it has too many problems still. It has too many errors. That is especially the case with the type of content that we work with. So medical content, technical content, when people have strong accents, the speech to text technology that's out there right now is mostly geared towards powering the voice assistants, so Alexa, Siri, etc. So they're really trained to recognize one person's voice and to learn how to transcribe that person's what that person says over time, better and better. So it's getting better at that. But speech to text is not very good yet at understanding people with accents, technical terms. They're not really good at consuming terminology, etc. So that does mean that we need services to create the captions and the transcripts. Other hurdles including workflows, the lack of standards, maybe the lack of expertise, specialized infrastructure. So there's the main hurdles that are typical to reach accessibility. I would argue, though, that making video content accessible is actually maybe easier than for other content types, because basically if you have a video player and if you add captions and transcripts and potentially audio descriptions, the things that need to be done are more contained than there might be for an EPUB, for example. And another thing that we've been exploring especially for captions and transcripts, are crowdsourcing opportunities. So the idea, for example, that if you have a large corpus of content, you can actually get the speakers themselves, the authors themselves, to edit their own transcripts, because nobody's going to know better than themselves what they have said. So as you're authoring a video, you can also author the transcript at the same time. So by doing so, you can reduce the cost. So in short, why should you care? Obviously, because I put a puppy on that slide. Otherwise, as I was saying, video and audio growing, legal requirements, commercial pressure, there's demand from vendors. The ROI is very measurable. It's also an achievable goal, and it's got incredible site benefits, and it's the right thing to do. So that's kind of the summary of all the arguments that I've laid out here. The last thing that I will say is that is actually a quote from the founder of Alexander Street Press, Stephen Rentott, who was telling me just years ago, before we even started the company, the path to your videos is paved with words. And words are mostly what makes content accessible. That's not it. That's not all of it. There's also technology, but it's mostly words that are going to help people consume the video better or have an alternative for understanding the video. And most of AI today is most of video-related AI today is actually a bit of a hack, because the first thing that happens is speech to text, and then machine learning does clever things. Well, people use machine learning to do clever things with video content, for indexing it, for searching through it, etc. So text is always going to be very important to this. So that's all I had today. I've got my Twitter handle, my email, if you're interested in any of this. But as I would say, I think if you want to reuse any of those arguments, by all means, go to that article that I shared in the beginning, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, Violane. And I will tell you that we are going to add the link to that article to the NISO event page, so people will be able to reach it. I did want to ask you a question, however, having to do with the transcripts and adding closed captions. You said that those were perhaps the costliest things to have to do. However, I was wondering if you could talk about what is needed in terms of time for creating those transcripts and closed captions. I know when everybody was suddenly moving over to Zoom to deliver their educational sessions, we did see a brief period where Zoom could get you the video very quickly, but it would take an extra day or two before you get the transcript. So I was curious if you could comment a little bit on what the time implications are for creating transcripts and adding closed captioning.
Sure. So that's the answer is actually quite simple. It's either you do it yourself and then it's as fast as you can do it. There are tools to do that. Or if you have vendors, they will just charge you more for a quicker turnaround. So for example, our partner has a 4 business day turnaround for captions typically, but you can get that down to 2 hours if you're paying a little bit more. So that's for edited closed captions reviewed by a person that have a 99.9% quality, which is pretty much what you need for anything to be really readable. Otherwise, though, there are more options now for live captioning, so which makes everything instantaneous, and automated captioning, obviously, that you can get. So typically what will happen is you will have you can have transcripts very quickly for either more many or with a few more mistakes in it, and then within a few days you can get a good transcript.
Okay, well, thank you for that.